Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We recently have been getting a lot of new and returning players into the private servers for Cycle, so I decided I was going to make a movement guide to help everybody get accustomed to the game. We will start with some basic concepts and eventually move into the more quote-unquote advanced stuff later in the video. Spoiler, most of it's on Boxer, as that one has most of the movement abilities in the game currently. Don't worry, there will not be any crazy stuff like Apex tap strafing or stuff like that, and none of it is going to require crazy keybinds like, rebinding your jump to your scroll wheel or anything like that. However, don't let that fool you. There is still a good bit of movement that we need to talk about here. And I do know I just said that it won't require any crazy keybinds, but we do have to talk about your settings. There's some very important ones we need to turn off. So with that being said, let's jump in. Alright, so getting into your settings. First things first, I'm going to come in here and you're going to want to turn off motion blur. Motion blur is extra bad in this game in my opinion. One, because it looks way worse in this game than I think it does in other games. But two, you spin around a lot more in this game than you do in other games for the movement, and you flick a whole bunch, so you do not want to have motion blur because it's going to make it really hard to see the other players. As for the rest of your graphic settings, just do what works for your computer to get max frames. View distance, you do not need to worry about if you cannot run a high view distance. It only affects foliage and I believe mobs. It does not affect players. Players will always render out to 150 meters and you cannot render them any further. And even if you change your render distance all the way down to low, you will still render players at 150 meters. And then for getting into actual movement keybinds, you're going to want to come over here and turn on sprint toggle. The sprint toggle allows you to hit the slides a lot easier when you are trying to slide left and right or whatever direction it is you're trying to slide. It lets you chain them a lot easier because you don't have to constantly press the shift key in between every single slide. I play with FOV based scaling and I recommend you do as well. It just makes the sensitivity cleaner when you're playing with the different scopes. And then if you intend to play Quicksuit, I recommend you come in here and you and you pick direction plus sprint. The double tap direction, in my opinion, feels very bad, and direction jump, I believe, is very bad as well because it forces you to jump sometimes because you don't quite have a dodge ready, and you'll try and dash, you'll end up jumping, and you do not want to be jumping unintentionally because when you're jumping, especially if you're using in-air damage, is very, very punishing in this game. You do not want to jump unless you need to in this game for the most part. And then other than that, for other settings that are useful to turn on is to come over here to show kill indicator. You're going to want to turn this off. So this will proc on both mobs and on players. Unfortunately though, on players, sometimes this leads to you stopping shooting when you haven't killed the other player yet, because due to how some of the guns and how some of the buffs interact, you end up with fractional damage numbers and you'll get a kill noise when you haven't actually killed them because they have like half an HP left when, on your screen their health bar is completely empty. It's usually not a super big deal if you want to play with it on. I just personally play with it off so that way I don't have that happen to me as often. And yeah, that's pretty much it for your settings. Alright, so now that we are done with the settings, we can go ahead and get into the actual movement portion of this video. So, the first thing to note about movement in this game is that your movement is directly affected by your weapon's weight. So you can see here, standing next to this wall, if I were to jump, you can see I come all the way up here to the top, and my vision gets blocked by that top beam. However, if I pull out my Karma, which is one of the heaviest weapons in the game, and I jump, you'll see I barely even get over this little lip here. With this in mind, it allows you to change your jump height on the fly, and you can even piggyback the lighter weapon's jump height into a heavier weapon like so, just simply by initiating your jump and then swapping after it's been initiated. So you'll see here, right as I'm about to leave the ground with Boxer, which is indicated by that charge at the bottom when you start charging a jump, I just go ahead and swap weapons. The reason for this is that the jump height is determined by the weight of the weapon at the time of initialization and is not affected by the weapon's weight after or during the jump, so you can piggyback the better movement speed into a heavier weapon. This ends up being massively important for moving around the map fluidly. I would not suggest utilizing this on the Quicksuit, as most of the time you will not get much use out of it. However, it is very, very strong on the Boxer and on the Dragonfly, so definitely keep it in mind for those. The next thing that we need to talk about is slide distance. Much like movement speed affecting your jump height, it also affects your slide distance. You can see here when I use the Karma and I slide, my slides are noticeably shorter than when I do a slide with the K28. This is actually very useful for movement because it allows you to use weapons to enhance your movement. So, technically speaking, Karma is one of the best movement weapons in the game, despite the fact that it has one of the heaviest weights and slows you down the most. Now that we've gone over that, let's actually get into learning how to slide. For learning how to slide, I recommend you actually first start in the station and just slide around as much as possible in the station. The reason for this is that when you are in the station, you can see when your character model starts to stand up, and as soon as you see your character model start to stand up, that lets you know that you can slide again. So it's a very useful tool for learning the slide timings and getting used to it. Once you've gotten used to slide timing in the station, I recommend you come back to the shooting range and you can get used to flick sliding in first person on the drone. So you can see here it provides a very good target for you to just constantly flick back and forth to get used to flick sliding and staying on target. And once you get comfortable with that, I recommend you interact with this console here to turn it on and make it start moving. And then once it starts moving, you can go ahead and practice on tracking a moving target while still maintaining your full movement with the flick slides. When it comes to actually fighting somebody, particularly with an auto weapon, and if they are using a sniper, you want to keep a mental note of how much damage you're doing every slide. You want to put about 150 to 200 damage in per slide. Reason for this is that if they hit a sniper shot, every sniper in this game is hitting over 250 damage, so that'll allow you to keep up with their damage. You do not want to be sliding too much if you're using a full auto weapon, especially against a sniper. You will most of the time lose the battle if you spend too much time sliding instead of focusing on actually landing shots. So a good mental note is to stick around that 150 to 200 damage in between each slide. Alright, so the last thing that I'm going to recommend you do as a new player is come to the laser drill site to practice two things. One, practice avoiding taking damage from the mobs. This is a very good place to practice sliding around the mobs to avoid damage, because there are ways that you can slide to avoid damage from mobs. And then the other thing it allows you to practice is target priority. Target priority in terms of mobbing is you always want to target the things that are going to swarm you and overwhelm you before you worry about things that are shooting at you. On this drill site, it's going to spawn initially a lot of grublings, maybe a Ravager, and a couple spitters. You are always going to want to prioritize the grublings and then the Ravager, and then you can worry about the spitter. The reason for this is that the things that are going to overwhelm you are going to block your shots on the ranged targets anyways, so you want to get them out of the way. And the other thing is that Ravagers will do the most damage, and when grublings swarm up on you, they will also do a lot of damage. So you always want to prioritize the things that are going to rush you down first, as they will make it harder to take care of the other enemies. You see there, I heard that stinger, so I immediately took it out. Stingers is one of the few mobs you want to break the targeting rule of worry about the swarmers first, just because stingers do so much damage. You do not want them to hit you. You don't have to kill them. You could just shoot them a couple times and stagger them. Another mob that breaks this rule is the howlers. If you ever see a howler, always focus them down. One, they do massive amounts of damage if they manage to hit you. And then two, they will spawn excess mobs that do not give you extra money, so you do not want them to stay around. And three, they will buff up the mobs that are close to them and cause them to regenerate health and do more damage, and it's just not fun. So you want to make sure you take out the howlers as quickly as possible. Sliding cover, we can go ahead and talk about our first suit, which is going to be the Anni Quicksuit. On the Anni, you have two basic movement functions. This is the only suit that has multiple movement functions that are intended to be a purely movement thing. Quicksuit has a double jump that I cannot show you because in the shooting range, it is bugged, unfortunately. I will not be able to show you the double and triple jump. However, they're pretty self-explanatory. The big thing about Anni is it has a dash in the beginning that I recommended to rebind your dash as a sprint plus a direction. The reason for that is I find that in combat, if I have it on double tap, when I'm strafing, I will either accidentally dash when I do not mean to, or I will be trying to dash, and for some reason, my stupid brain just doesn't like the double tap function, where I'll end up stopping and then double tapping instead of doing it fluidly in the movement. So, what I would recommend, like I said, set it to sprint and a direction, and then on your mouse, like say if you have a Logitech, you put sprint key onto your mouse. The other thing you can do on the Quicksuit is that when you are sprinting, if you slide and hop, you'll get propelled forward. You can hear it. It gives you like that special audio cue, and it takes away one of your charges. This slide hop can be combined with the flick slides to essentially have a slide hop in any direction. So the last thing that you can do with the Quicksuit is this. You can see that I'm like doing a dash jump at the same time out of my dodge. I actually do not recommend doing this. The timing is insanely tight to the point where you will mess it up more often than not. In order to achieve what I'm showing off in the video right now, I had to make a macro because the timing is that tight. It is literally within fractions of a second that you have to press the buttons in order to achieve this. So I just do not recommend doing this. It is not worth learning. Being stuck into a jump is just not worth it all, in my opinion. Okay, so now moving on to our next suit, which is the Dragonfly. The Dragonfly is a traditional jetpack, if you're familiar with other games, but unlike other jetpacks, it has a ground pound mechanic to get you down out of the air faster, and it will also deal damage to enemies. A couple things to note about the Dragonfly is that if you crouch before you jump, you will get extra height on your jump. As you can see here, I can make it all the way up to the top. However, if I do not crouch before I jump, then I don't quite make it. Another thing you can do to completely prevent yourself from having to crouch, if you press slide right as you touch the ground, you can actually skip that crouch. Additionally, you can also move out of your ground pound, which I'll show you now. You can see here, I can slide and jump coming out of that, which I did it at the same time there. The last thing to note before we get into combinations with abilities is that you can do what's called a bike fling on the Dragonfly, which is driving your bike and then jumping off. It works best if you do it on a ledge to fling yourself and utilize the Dragonfly's momentum preservation to get a good bit of extra distance off it. Okay, now getting into the synergies that the Dragonfly has with abilities. The Dragonfly is very, very strong with both Directional Warp and Adrenaline, and they are what I absolutely recommend you run with this suit. I do not play Dragonfly without either of them. So, for Adrenaline Warp, when you pop it, you will get a bunch of bonus movement speed, which transfers to your Dragonfly jetpack, which allows you to get very good lateral movement out of your Dragonfly suit, which you don't normally really get out of it. You do have some lateral movement normally, but not anywhere near as much as you will get with the Adrenaline popped. Additionally, while adrenaline is popped, you will also get faster slam animation and faster slam's dive speed, which are both very good for getting away from fights if you need to, or even getting into fights if somebody is far away. As for directional warp, very much like the bike fling, the directional warp gives you momentum when you throw it and initially come out of it. So, using Dragonfly, you can conserve that momentum to get extra lateral movement. So you'll see here, if I'm sprinting, I warp, and then I putter out of it, I get a good bit of momentum coming out of there. It's nowhere near as much as you get off of a bike fling, obviously, because you're moving much, much slower than a bike. However, it's still very useful, especially when combined with adrenaline, which stacks the effects of this. So, the last thing to note about the Dragonfly is that you can use certain abilities in the slam. Stims and, funny enough, directional warp can be used while in the slam animation. This leads to you being able to activate a slam, and while you are descending, throw a warp, so that way you do a teleport in the middle of the slam, which carries your slam momentum out of the teleport, allowing you to get some crazy distance. Alright, so now we are here on the Boxer. This is the suit that I personally play the most. I find it the most enjoyable. It has the most things you can do in combination with your abilities to get extra movement. It also gives you, in my opinion, the most versatility in what abilities you can run. Because depending upon what mods you can give up a warp, I wouldn't recommend it because warp is just that strong. However, you could choose to not run it on Boxer. It's about the only suit I can get away with it on. We'll go ahead and stand against this back wall here so you can see how far a punch normally goes. Let me line up on this. You can see a normal punch goes about 20 meters-ish. If you time your warp and your punch correctly, you can delay the punch activation until after the end of your warp, giving you essentially an extended warp. It's very simple. You just throw your warp and then immediately hold down the punch button like this. And as you can see, a lot farther. 50 meters this time. It's very, very strong. Now, the next thing is adrenaline. Just like with the Boxer, it gives you some really, with the Dragonfly, it gives you some really good benefits on Boxer. If I punch with adrenaline on, you can see I get about 10 extra meters on my punch with that adrenaline. So it's very, very, very strong in combination. And yes, I'm sure you're probably wondering, you can combine the punch warp and the adrenaline to get an even further warp punch. Much like with the punch, you can actually do the same tech with the jump and punch to get an even further warp, because I'll show you here now, if you jump before you punch, you get a farther punch. However, you can combine all of this. So if you do the exact same thing as the punch, where if you throw and then immediately charge your jump, you can get a delayed jump activation on the Boxer. And then you can combine that with a punch, and you can see I just got nearly 70 meters in one foul swoop without even using my adrenaline. That's a lot of ground to cover. That's a very big gap to cross, especially nearly instantaneously. And that pretty much concludes all the movement stuff, particularly the synergies with the suits. Yeah, hope this helped, and then we'll go ahead and get into the mods next. So, we're going to start off by getting into the mods that I recommend, and at the end I will go over the mods that I am currently using, and we're going to go in the same order as the movement showcase. So we're going to start off with the Anni Quicksuit. starting off with the suit cores, I recommend that you run Power Dodge, Extra Charge, or Fragile Charges. Fragile Charges will be active as long as you have shield left. Extra Charge, well, just gives you an extra charge, it's very nice. And then Power Dodge is a damage reduction on dash, plus a couple other perks that are in the perk description. A very, very strong perk. That's the one I use personally. Alright, moving over to the Dragonfly, you're going to want to be running either aim to hover, slow and steady, or dive angle. I personally recommend dive angle because it gives you the most movement options, especially when combined with warp. Slow and steady is also very good, and you can use aim to hover. You just have to be very careful with it. You can often accidentally end up in the air when you don't want to because you slide jump while aiming, and that just locks you in the air. Alright, so moving on to the Boxer. The recommendations for the Boxer are going to be Fast Punch, Punch Cooldown, and Shield Core. Punch Cooldown is what I use and what I absolutely recommend you use. However, you can get away with Punch Cooldown, and if you don't want to run either of those, you can use Shield Core because it'll give you 100 extra health, which stacks with the 100 extra health from the mod in slot 2, which will give you 200 total health extra, which is very good for newer players, as oftentimes you take a lot of damage from PvE when you're new. For your slot 1 or tier 1 mods, I'm going to recommend Blood Rush, Master of Arms, and No Interruptions. There is no particular order of hierarchy here, kind of like there was with the suit core mods. However, I am going to say my recommendation is Blood Rush for new players, as it'll make it very, very easy to survive PvE. It gives you a stacking 2.5% damage buff. Each stack lasts for 10 seconds, and it stacks uncapped, so you can stack as many times as you want. Or what I personally use is Master of Arms. I personally really like the gun handling, it feels super nice, but you cannot go wrong with any of these three. Alright, moving on to your slot 2 or tier 2 mods, I am going to recommend Stronger Shield, Core Stabilizer, or Gravity Balancer. Personally, I run Stronger Shield. Sometimes I run Core Stabilizer, but most of the time I'm staying on Stronger Shield. I think it's just the best all-around perk. Gives that 100 extra shield, good survivability. You really cannot go wrong. The other two are good, I just don't personally use them at all. Okay, so moving on to your tier 3 or slot 3 mods, my recommendation is faster ability cooldowns. Personally, I will not run anything else. I only run this mod exclusively. However, some runner-up perks will be Storm Runner or Pistol Master. Alright, so the last thing we need to talk about before we go over the mods that I am using, we need to talk about in-air damage. In-air damage is very, very strong, but it's also very, very punishing. It gives you 15% extra damage when you are in the air, but it also makes you take 25% damage more. It makes it extremely punishing to jump at the wrong time, and that is a habit that most players have to break when they come to this game because they're so used to jumping around a whole bunch in other games. So I do not recommend you play this perk until you get used to this game and break that habit of jumping, and then you can start experimenting with it. So that'll go ahead and wrap up everything that we need to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and flash the mods that I use up on screen now. And with that, I'm going to let these play out to the end of the video. And hopefully you guys learned something. Hopefully you guys will be able to take this and apply it in game. And I hope to see you guys around Cycle. And y'all have a good one. Peace.